Want to learn how to make better decisions in 3 easy steps? Stick around. Every day we make hundreds of decisions. Without the ability to make decisions, we wouldn't even be able to get out of bed in the morning. But we can get better at making decisions, making them faster and sticking to the decisions that we make better. People are pretty bad at making decisions. They're bad at making those decisions. They're bad at not changing their mind after they've made a decision. And they're particularly bad at accepting decisions made by other people. A big part of my career was driven by being better at decision making than the people around me. That doesn't mean I'm amazing at making decisions, just that I'm better than the relatively low bar that most people set. Every day you make tons of decisions. And decisions are critical for your everyday life, but also everything you do and the people around you. I'm going to do a little digression about biases. We're built out of biases. Biases are why tigers don't eat us. It's why we react quickly, and it prevents us from getting ourselves into a ton of danger. Research on biases is an entire field, so I'm not going to dig into it too much. Biases aren't inherently bad. They're what allow us to make decisions at all. But we really need to be aware of our own biases and know when they may be making us make bad decisions. In particular, we really need to be aware of when biases are predisposing us to listen to certain kinds of people or not listen to certain kinds of people, because that's a particular area where biases can be particularly dangerous. For a variety of reasons, making a decision, even if it's a bad one, is usually better than making no decision. As humans, we're usually better at comparisons than evaluation. So once you have made a decision, that provides an anchor point around which you can then make changes and evaluate different possibilities and different possible decisions. Though this leads to an obvious question for those of you that looked up all the biases 10 seconds ago. What about anchor point bias? Yes, this is a true risk. If you make a decision, that will provide an anchor, and then there will be anchor point bias around that point. For those of you who didn't run off and look it up, an anchor point bias is a bias where you have a tendency to trust the information or decision that you already have over new information. There's a tendency to iterate off of that initial point. This is particularly true with decisions that involve math. Once someone throws a number onto the table, then new numbers and new information has a tendency to change that initial number incrementally, as opposed to potentially radically changing that decision making. You see this around discussions of sales projections or team sizes or the length of time that something is going to take. But I would argue that even with that anchor point bias, it is critically important to make that decision. If you're going to have an anchor point bias, better to have it be your anchor point as opposed to the anchor point provided by someone else, someone whose decision that you may not trust. In my experience with creative people, it's actually the opposite of anchor point bias that you have to worry about. I'm not going to look up the specific name for that bias, but let's call it grass is always greener bias. And this is a tendency for creative people to actually have a disdain or rejection of an existing or pre-made decision, and actually be more likely to change because new information comes along. It causes them to rethink or question a decision that they have already made. Let's move on to the process of actually making a decision. For that, we are going to need a few visual aids. So we're going to bring in something. This is the decision J-curve, very scientifically calibrated in units that I'm not going to show you. The horizontal axis is the amount of information you have in your decision-making process, and then on the vertical axis is the quality of the decision that's being made. Now, depending on the decision that you're making, you might have a curve that looks more like this, where the amount of information very quickly improves your decision-making, but often actually the curve looks a lot more like this, where it takes a long time for your initial decision to be improved upon. And potentially you just get back to where you started. Final decision you make after gathering lots of information and lots of deliberation is the same decision that you would have made in those opening moments after you understood the question that was being asked. Often when you see J-curves, they're used to make the argument that you should push through that bad point to actually get to a better outcome. But I'm actually going to make the opposite argument, that often that initial decision, that knee-jerk decision, is actually the one that you want to go with. That the extra effort required to reach a better point is often not worth the effort, because most of the decisions you're making day to day actually have consequences that do not warrant the additional energy required to reach reach that slightly better decision. It's also important to remember that timeliness is a factor in the quality of a decision. A decision made now, even a relatively poor one, often serves you better than a better decision made later. Decisions have expiry dates. Making a fast decision is often better than making a slow one. So now we're going to walk through each of the various parts of this J-curve. This is the beginning of the decision-making process. This is where what you're doing more than anything is identifying the issue and identifying the decision that is actually needed to be made. This is the most critical point of decision-making. The more accurate the question you are attempting to answer, the better that initial answer is going to be, and the less time it's going to take you to make that decision. When you're identifying the decision that needs to be made, it's important to involve the right people in that process. But you want to involve the minimum number of people that you can in order to make sure that you know the decision correctly. If you don't involve enough people, the right people, that's going to reduce buy-in in that decision and then increases the chance that you're going to have to churn that decision as you realize that you've missed critical things that needed to be considered in the decision-making process. This is the point where you want to look around the room and make sure that you have a diverse set of voices sitting at the table, not just from different disciplines, but also different levels of seniority and different backgrounds, different experiences, because that's going to make sure that you're asking the right question. That group, that set of voices, is dependent upon the questions being asked, and tuning it in so that you have enough diversity for the question that's being asked is a trick. Some cases, decisions can and should be made by a single person. In some cases, you need to involve very large groups of people. You want to involve the minimum number that you can to get to the right questions being asked. If you involve too many people in the decision-making process, the actual act of identifying the problem is going to turn into this churn engine that's going to result in that initial identification taking longer than it needs to take. Once you've identified the decision that needs to be made, there usually is an obvious or instinctive or immediate answer that comes to mind. And often, that's all the decision that you need. Again, you need to consider the consequences of this decision and if it's worth pushing further to get a higher quality decision. Because if you do push further, then you enter into this part of the curve where it's all second guessing and churn. Every new piece of information is going to change the way that you look at the question. Sometimes decisions are critical. Sometimes you need to push through that J-curve and get to a better decision. Okay, so you've decided to push through and get an even better decision. My first question is, are you sure? Are you sure that the decision you haven't already made, that instinctual decision, isn't a good enough decision? Really think about that. Okay, so you've decided you're going to do it. You're going to push through. Okay, last chance to turn back. You're sure? Absolutely sure? Okay, then let's get started. Step one, what are your success criteria? When do you know that you've made a good enough decision? I'll say this, that there is no perfect decision, so you're not looking for perfection, you're looking for good enough. So you need to start by identifying what your success criteria look like and when you are able to stop. If you're pushing through, it should be because you have a good idea of what you're trying to achieve. You should be able to put a metric or a measurement against it. If you can't, then you're never going to know when you've done what you need to do. And you're going to be stuck in the churn part of the J-curve forever. Now that you've got your success criteria, you need to prioritize them. Get them in the order of most important to least important. But as part of prioritization, I will say this, your criteria are going to overlap. If, for example, you're looking to buy a new floor polisher and your criteria are cost and quality, if you put cost above quality and that's an absolute priority, then the very cheapest thing to do is to not buy a floor polisher at all. So obviously there are overlaps and places where there's a minimum bar for your various success criteria. So identify all of that. Now that you've done that, you've got your success criteria, you've got them in priority order, time to go gather data. Go look at the different options and look how they check the different boxes in your criteria. Unfortunately, if you're feeling like this is a bit overwhelming, you want to go back to the start, it's too late now. Once you start down this road, you are going to have to gather data. You can't ignore the data that you've already started to gather. Your evaluation of the problem has been changed, has been corrupted to some degree by this process. So your instinctual decision is no longer going to cut it. So you got to keep going. And this is why you have to be so careful about starting down this road in the first place. Because when you start pushing your way through the J-curve, you have to finish the job. You have to push your way all the way to that other side. You can't go back. So now you've got some data and you're going to evaluate that against your success criteria. And in doing so, you may decide that you want to actually refine or change your success criteria. So do so. Now get more data and do that again and go through this loop as many times as you need to. And how do you know when you're done? Well, that's why those success criteria up front are so important, because once you cross the line into meeting those criteria, once you have a good enough decision, you're done. Now, one thing I've seen with this process is it can actually be used by people to just confirm that decision they made up front. This is very much something that is going to fall into confirmation bias. I've worked with people who believe themselves to be incredibly data-driven, but actually are simply using this process of gathering data and evaluating criteria in order to just confirm the decision they've already made. If that's what you're doing, you're just wasting time. You're better off to just use that initial decision, that instinctual decision, and move along with that. This process is time consuming, it's annoying, it involves a lot of stakeholders, so I would only use it in cases where it is necessary to reach the best decision that you can. In most cases, as I've said before, that first instinctual decision is probably an adequate decision, and the time investment required to go through all of this process is not required. Finally, it's worth remembering that the timeliness of a decision affects its quality as well. So spending a lot of time trying to make a decision can actually degrade the quality of the decision. So hopefully now you've done all this, you've gone through this, and now you've reached a decision. And hopefully that decision is better than the one you made in the first place, but it might not be. You've reached the end, you've made a decision, well done. But can you let that decision stand? When new information comes along, can you give the benefit of the doubt to the already made decision and not constantly churn by readdressing, changing direction, and making new decisions on slightly different information? You made your decision. Now, as you're acting upon that decision, you might think everything is great, but actually now you're into a very dangerous part of the process, because as you're acting on that decision, new information is coming up and it's going to cause you to second guess that decision you've already made. It's like you're going through the J curve, except that decision is already made. Remember when I was talking about timeliness of decision making? Well, nothing is less timely than actually changing a decision after you're already starting to act upon a different version of that decision. We should always try to give benefit of doubt to an already made decision. It's very easy for us to second guess ourselves and reverse decisions as new information comes in. There's a reasonable chance that that new information that's telling you that you need to change your decision is misleading, that you don't have full context, and that instinctual decision or the decision you spent all that time making is still better. That's what the J curve is all about, is you're moving down through this information curve and you actually know less than you think you do. A strategy of people who disagree with an already made decision is to often try to set up a scenario where they present information that makes a different direction look better. One of the ways to do this is by removing context, removing stakeholders, obfuscating the true question that is being answered. If you've gone through the J curve, then it's important that you document your decision-making process, because otherwise you can get to a point where new information comes along and you no longer remember or have the context for the decision and direction that you chose. If you find yourself in this situation, you have to be really careful. That already made decision was made for a reason. If you're missing that context, you have to be very careful not to change direction without understanding the reason for the direction in the first place. Know that there are people who will exploit this ignorance to try to reframe your decision and undermine the decision-making process. So be careful. But even if that new decision would actually be better, the consequence of change is heavy. There's always churn caused by a change in direction. This is not to say that you should never reverse direction, only that the burden of proof for that change needs to lie with the new direction, the change, not the current direction. There can be a tendency for people to want to change, to overvalue the new information, and because of that, to actually push for change. But again, every time you change, that's causing churn. If you take nothing else away from this video, it's that specific thing, which is trust the decision that is made, and as new information comes along, be very careful about whether or not you're going to change direction. Sometimes you will get enough information and it will show you that a new direction, a new decision would actually be better, and that you trust that. But even that shouldn't necessarily be enough. It needs to be enough better, enough different that it's worth the cost of the change. So weigh these changes very, very carefully. Your job as a leader isn't necessarily to make decisions, it's to cause decisions to be made. Now, sometimes that means you're going to be the one making decisions, but sometimes that means you're empowering other people to make decisions. When a decision is made by someone else, it's very easy to feel that a change is needed because their instincts, their biases are going to cause them to make different decisions than you would make. We tend to distrust decisions that are different from our instinctual answers, but that doesn't mean that they're wrong. That doesn't mean that they should be changed. Again, like before, you need to give the benefit of the doubt, the momentum to the decision that has already been made. Hopefully you have a team of talented people around you. They're experts in their own fields. They have different specialization, and that difference in specialization likely leads to different decisions. Those aren't necessarily bad decisions. Give the benefit of the doubt to the made decision. Even if you know for a fact that the decision you would have made is better than the decision that they have made, you have to be very careful about reversing those decisions being made by your team, being made by other people. Because if you do that, you cause the churn that we've talked about before, but also you're disempowering that person from making decisions. And in the future, they're going to be much slower and much less willing to make a decision in the first place. Even if the decision isn't the one you would make, even if you know that there's a better decision to be had, hold yourself back, let the decision stand, if at all possible. Okay, time to land this. We're almost there. Just stick with me for a little bit more. Okay, some final thoughts on decision making. First of all, every decision takes energy. The more complicated the decision, the more energy it takes. The greater the stakes of the decision, the more energy it takes. I've had the privilege for most of my life, the decisions that I have made about what to eat, where to sleep, what to wear have been low stakes. I might end up paying too much for a hamburger, but I can absorb that. Other people, that's not the same case. That same decision might have a material impact to their lives. So you need to think about this in the decision-making process. What might be a very easy decision for you to make might be very difficult for someone else. Even so, even low-stake decisions still cost something. Every minor, inconsequential decision that you make takes some of your energy. Each of these that you can eliminate will leave you more energy for the decisions that truly matter. So consider removing unnecessary decisions from your day. So it's worth talking about what happens when you're on the other side of a decision change. You've made a decision and now someone with greater authority or greater power than you comes along and changes that decision on you. First of all, that does suck. Now, sometimes this is going to happen for good reasons. Sufficient new data has come along, or your initial decision was based on faulty data or a faulty understanding of the decision that needed to be made. However, sometimes this will happen for a bad reason because people are just trusting their own gut over trusting you, or they're just reacting to new data. If it's possible in your situation, you should feel comfortable pushing back on decisions if you feel that it was done for a bad reason. However, alignment is important, so be aware that there's a limit to how much pushback you should be doing. Eventually, it is necessary for you to accept and align on decisions. Even when one of your decisions has been overturned, even if that happened for a bad reason, you need to try to not allow that to affect your willingness to make a decision the next time. Everyone needs to make decisions every day in their job, in their life, and you need to become better at it. And you need to be comfortable making decisions. So to summarize, make decisions. They're important. Be aware of your biases so you understand how they are affecting your decision-making process. Trust your gut and trust that initial decision. More information isn't usually worth the delay in the decision-making. Once a decision has been made, give the momentum and the benefit of the doubt to that made decision and avoid changing decisions too often. In particular, trust the decisions made by others, even if they aren't the decision that you would have made. Make sure you're answering the right question and involve the right people in figuring out what the right question is. Don't let other people changing your decisions prevent you from making decisions in the future. Every decision takes energy, so try to eliminate as many decisions from your day as you can. But I promised you 3 easy steps, didn't I? Okay, I'm not even going to put up a graphic for this. 1, make sure you're answering the right decision. 2, make the decision. 3, stick to the decision. Just with those 3 steps, you'll make decisions faster and you'll actually stick to them, and that will have a better result. Decisions are critical to shipping a game. They're critical to so many things within our day-to-day lives. I thought it was worth revisiting revisiting this one. Let me know what you thought about this. This is a remaster of one of the very early videos I did on the channel. It's not exactly less work than making a brand new video, but I thought it was a good experiment. If you enjoyed this, let me know that down in the comments. If you hated it because the audio wasn't capable of being adequately upgraded, or for whatever reason, let me know that down in the comments as well. We will revisit doing remasters based upon your feedback. We'll definitely do them for some of the videos, but the more positive the response to this video is, the more likely we are to do more videos of this type. Special thanks to my members. They provide the resources that this channel needs to keep running. If you're interested in becoming a member, there's a link to that down in the description. We also have a merch store. There's a shelf below the channel. I'm currently wearing File It All and Let Triage Sort It Out. If you're interested in picking something up, the store is below the video as well. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up. If you watched it back in the day and rewatched it now, I thank you. I think it's worth revisiting this topic on a fairly frequent basis. I will see you again soon. Thank you.